Welcome to today's explainer. Okay, listen, we are going to challenge literally everything you thought you knew about motivation today. Normally, we think of negative inputs as things we need to avoid at all costs, right? But today, we're diving into the fascinating science and psychology of how high performers, I'm talking everyone from elite athletes to top tier CEOs, actually use negative forces like fear and punishment to create absolutely massive positive results. So, what does this all mean? Well, it forces us to immediately rethink our most basic natural instincts. As human beings, we are biologically wired to run away from fear and avoid punishment. It's just how we're built. But what if that exact instinct is the very thing holding you back from your true potential? What if those incredibly uncomfortable feelings are actually an untapped energy source just waiting to be harnessed? Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Rethinking negative motivation. 2. Crossing the fear frontier. 3. The fear-setting framework. 4. The self-efficacy factor. 5. The elite coaching paradox. And 6. Using fear as fuel. All right, jumping right into section 1, rethinking negative motivation and looking at negative inputs as fuel. We've basically been taught our whole lives that negative inputs only hurt us, but the research reveals a massive paradigm shift. As researcher Patrick Sweeney points out, courage in fact requires fear. Think about it. You literally cannot build courage or reach your ultimate potential if you completely eliminate fear from your life. Sweeney brings up his fantastic historical example, the intense rivalry between Samuel Pierpont Langley and the Wright brothers to achieve the first flight. So Langley had massive funding, this prestigious reputation, and a whole team of experts. But because he had so much status to lose, he operated with a fixed mindset. He was a victim of fear, totally unable to adapt his failed designs because, well, failure meant public humiliation. The Wright brothers, they had practically no funding and zero public reputation to protect. They had nothing to lose, so they fully embraced the danger and uncertainty of it all. They actively harnessed that uncertainty and used fear as fuel to iterate incredibly fast. Sweeney argues that fear is actually the underlying phenomenon that heightens our awareness, optimizes our physical performance, and drives world-changing ambition. Which brings us to section 2, the fear frontier, crossing the roadblock. Sweeney's research highlights that there are essentially only two ways we make decisions. When your amygdala, that small almond-shaped gland at the base of your brain, hijacks your nervous system, it makes decisions based purely on survival. And the funny thing about the amygdala is that it completely lacks nuance. It reacts to an intimidating email from your boss the exact same way it reacts to a charging grizzly bear. It just wants to fight, flee, or freeze so you can live another day. That's deciding out of fear, and honestly, it almost always leads to long-term regret. But if you actively choose to reframe that fear and make decisions out of opportunity, you shift your focus entirely to thriving. Even if the situation is incredibly scary, choosing opportunity forces you to learn something and inevitably gets you closer to your goal. Bottom line, fear just helps you survive the day. Opportunity makes you thrive over a lifetime. Let's move into section 3, the fear-setting framework, logically mapping anxiety. So how do we actually do this? Well, it brings us to a highly structured tool based on Tim Ferriss's groundbreaking concept, the define, prevent, and repair layout. This is how you logically dismantle your anxieties. First, you explicitly define the nightmare scenario. Like, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen if you take this terrifying leap? Then you move to the prevent column. What practical steps can you take right now to reduce the likelihood of that nightmare actually happening? And finally, the repair column. If the worst-case scenario does strike, how can you recover? By explicitly writing this down, you perform this amazing psychological magic trick. You take fear out of the emotional, reactive amygdala and force it into the prefrontal cortex, the logical, problem-solving part of your brain. This physical shift in brain activity actively calms your nervous system and turns this vague, overwhelming dread into a simple, manageable checklist. But we also have to evaluate the cost of doing absolutely nothing. We always measure the risk of taking action, right? But we rarely step back to measure the risk of staying exactly where we are. What are the emotional, physical, and financial costs of your inaction over the next 6 months? What about in a year or 3 years down the line? When you actually take the time to deeply map this out, you almost always realize a pretty startling truth. The slow, creeping, long-term cost of playing it safe is actually way more terrifying than the acute, short-term risk of trying something new. Okay, on to section 4, the self-efficacy factor, belief in abilities. To understand how we push past fear when it's applied externally, we have to look at Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory.
Now, self-efficacy is fundamentally different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is just a general feeling of self-worth. Self-efficacy, on the other hand, is your deep-seated belief in your specific ability to execute a particular task. Bandura found that this is the single most important determinant in an individual's motivation. People with high self-efficacy persevere significantly longer. They expend way more effort and they bounce back from failure much faster. So how do you build it? Primarily through two things. First, mastery experiences. This is the undeniable proof of doing the work, like a gymnast actually landing a complex backflip on their own. Second is verbal persuasion, which is having a trusted coach or a mentor look you right in the eye and say, you have the exact skill set to do this. It relies on strong internal choices and evidence, not just reacting blindly to external pressures.
This dynamic perfectly sets up a massive divide in how we are coached and motivated. Researchers Newton and Duda found that task-oriented motivation, where a coach openly rewards effort and personal improvement, fundamentally builds that critical self-efficacy. It makes athletes feel highly competent and totally in control of their own destiny. On the flip side, we have ego-oriented motivation. This environment values natural ability and pure results above all else, and it relies incredibly heavily on punishing mistakes. Historically, psychological research shows that this ego-oriented, punishment-heavy environment creates high levels of performance anxiety, leads to athlete burnout, and severely damages a person's confidence. It raises the stakes so high that athletes become terrified of making even the smallest error.
That brings us right into Section 5, the elite coaching paradox, the use of punishment. In his 2010 dissertation on elite male gymnasts, who, by the way, are athletes performing at the highest possible levels of physical and mental pressure, Jason Selk uncovered a huge paradox. If punishment destroys self-efficacy, why on earth do top-tier coaches still use it? Well, the data reveals something genuinely shocking. These elite athletes actually have a highly complex, almost favorable relationship with punishment. They openly report that strict punishment from their coaches increases their skill achievement and significantly spikes their motivation to train harder in the short term. I know it sounds crazy that an athlete would actually want to be punished, but the coaches deeply understand that this negative input can drive an immediate intense spike in focus and effort. But the real mystery here is, how do they use it without completely crushing the athlete's internal belief? The solution to that exact paradox lies in 5 incredibly strict conditions. Silk's research found that punishment only works as a powerful motivator without destroying an athlete's self-efficacy if every single one of these pillars is in place. First up, perceived honesty. The coach must be unflinchingly truthful about when the athlete is doing well and doing poorly. Second, belief in capabilities. The athlete must deeply, undeniably know the coach believes they can ultimately succeed. Third, trust. The athlete has to fully buy into the coach's overarching plan for their career. Fourth, and actually, this is probably the most critical one, congruence. The coach and the athlete both have to agree on the assessment of the effort given. If an athlete feels they just gave 100% effort, but the coach punishes them for being lazy, their self-efficacy absolutely plummets. They have to be on the same page. And finally, consistency. The coach must reliably follow through on preset rewards and punishments without playing favorites. When these 5 conditions are perfectly met, punishment stops being a chaotic tool of fear and transforms into highly effective, structured feedback.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, using fear as fuel, harnessing negative input. We've seen how negative inputs operate both inside our own minds and in the most elite training environments in the world. As Patrick Sweeney says, the path to a fulfilling life is not to avoid fear, but to recognize it, understand it, harness it, and unleash its power. Whether it's an internal phobia keeping you from taking a massive career leap, or a tough coach's external punishment pushing you to perfect a routine, negative inputs are not inherently evil. They're literally just energy. Instead of retreating into our amygdala survival mode and avoiding the uncomfortable at all costs, we can choose to be like the elite performers. We can intentionally process these intense psychological drives, logically map them out, ensure the right supportive conditions are met, and use them as high-octane fuel for our ultimate performance. So, I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to consider today. What is your own fear frontier? What are the actual heavy consequences of you doing absolutely nothing for the next 3 years? Start redefining your fears, map them out logically, and you might just find that the very thing you have been running away from is the exact fuel you need to succeed. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.